The essence of basketball. I don't know if you can be a basketball player without experience.
B-Ball Radio.
Peace, everybody. It's another episode of B-Ball Radio. Whoa. My name is Bobbito Garcia, a.k.a. Cool Bob Love. The co-host is...
E-New. Summertime is still here. Bob, great to be back. B-Ball Radio.
Yes, and we are joined by an esteemed guest today, author, former Slam Magazine contributor, former UTEP coach, former scout who recruited Tim Hardaway to Texas El Paso, a friend to Don Haskins, and also a community activist in El Paso. We're going to talk about all that. He is currently the author of this incredible book, Big Time, a fiction about Coors State University, a cash-strapped college that sells its naming rights. Russ, Coach Russ, friend Russ, brother Russ, pick up basketball Russ. How you doing, man? Welcome to the show.
Good, Bob. It's good to see you again. And hi, Eric. Good to meet you.
Yeah, man. We are going to talk about your books, your travels to Ireland, and all that. But I've known you for almost 20 years now. I first learned about you reading the pages of Slam Magazine when your Patio on the Hardwood title came out about coaching in Ireland. We shortly became friends and then eventually collaborated on a couple of projects over the years. I never asked you, though, how the hey does a dribbling machine from Chicago wind up getting a job at University of Texas El Paso under legendary coach Don Haskins? Did he find you? Did you find him? Did you send a letter of intent? Were you going for a master's degree? I don't know this part of your history, and I'm ashamed that I've never asked you that over a hot dog at basketball in a barrio.
Well, we'd have burritos there, but I was 22 years old and wrote I wanted to be a college coach, and I was actually working as a security guard in Chicago, but an assistant coach after school. But I wrote to every Division I coach in America. At that time, I think there's maybe 260 Division I schools, and
no way.
I was already a better writer than I was a coach, and I got almost no responses. Judd Heathcote wrote me back from Michigan State to say, "Hey, you got to personalize these letters." But Don Haskins had Tim Floyd reach out to me, and I remember sitting at the desk when the call came in, and it was Texas El Paso, and I thought, "Oh, that's Nate Archibald." And so, I flipped open the directory, and when Tim Floyd called and was able to say, "Oh, how are the minors doing? How did the minors do this year?" And this was 1983. So I went down there. I was 23 years old when I went as a graduate assistant, and pretty quickly got promoted just because someone left the staff, and Don Haskins believed in small staffs. There was just 3 assistant coaches and him, and got pretty quickly promoted from a graduate assistant to a $10,000 full-time assistant. And that's when I was lucky enough to stumble on Tim Hardaway.
Wait.
Wow.
Yeah.
I have so many questions.
Yeah. Go ahead, Eric. Jump in because I have questions too. But that's a great summary for a 30-minute episode.
Sorry, but I thought I'd get to the point. So I had Chicago ties, and where I'd sort of made a name for myself in a different way than you, Bobbito, is I used to go around to the summer camps, mostly in Chicago, but a little bit around the Midwest and that kind of thing. And I had a dribbling demonstration. This is well before the And One tour, and that before it really revolutionized ball handling drills. But I would go around, it was blindfolded and gloves on, and would go to the summer camps, and I would charge $100 to the high schools and $250 to the universities, and was all over the Midwest doing that. And I think that really got Don Haskins and Tim Floyd's attention, not so much that they wanted to see the dribbling drills, but, there's a certain obsession and sort of energy that it takes to become good at the dribbling drills, as you well know. And I think that they thought not so much that I could help with the ball handling aspects of the UTEP minor basketball team, but that this was the kind of energy and drive and obsession that really came in handy for recruiting and to be successful in college sports.
So, were you the Midwest Ron Niclario?
Well, let me think. He's the high school coach in New York. Is that right?
Cardozo, yeah.
Cardozo, yes.
Cardozo, yeah.
Who's known to get out on the floor and do all the things that you're talking about.
Well,
everywhere.
I'm pretty well regarded. I never played in high school, which was another part of the story. And I just thought I wanted to be I got this idea that I could be the greatest dribbler in the world, which is a nutty idea. And to think that you could play in college after not making the high school team, but I just kept doing the dribbling drills. I just was completely obsessed with doing dribbling drills and wound up making the team at North Park College, which your listeners have probably never heard of, unless they're Division III fanatics, because North Park won 3 Division III championships in a row, and I was on one of those teams, but it was really a groundbreaking. No one other than UCLA has ever won 3 titles in men's NCAA before or since. And so for somebody that wanted to be a coach, it was really a great way to get into coaching. I was, sitting next to the head coach while we were winning a Division III and hoping to get in the game. I rarely got in the games. I scored 13 points in my Division III career. I'm generally regarded, Eric, as the worst player in North Park College history, but I was there in a really exciting time when we were dominating Division III. One of our players, Michael Harper, went on and played for the Trailblazers for a couple of years. And
wow.
And so for somebody who wanted to be a coach, it was really a great way to start. And soon after that, but I came to find out that no one really cared that much about Division III, except for the real insiders in college sports. So I thought, well, how am I going to get my coaching career started? And wound up writing, as I said, to every Division I school in America. And UTEP came calling. It was really a miracle. So I went from being, at age 23, I was sitting on the bench next to Don Haskins and Tim Floyd. And we were 28-3, I think, my first year at UTEP, ranked number 8 in the nation. And that kind of thing. Wound up losing to UNLV in the NCAA tournament. But it was, for a Division III bench warmer suddenly to land at a top 20 program was really an eye-opening experience.
That is, I mean, Russ, I've known you for 20 years and I did not know this. And I know the name Tim Floyd. Can you fill in for our listeners who that is? Because Don Haskins is, the legendary coach of NCAA, we're going to get to him in a second. Eric's going to ask you a question about that, but yeah, Tim Floyd, why does that name ring bells?
Well, Floyd was sort of Don Haskins, of course, was the architect of the 1966, the racial pioneering team, but he'd fallen on hard times in the late 70s where he had 3 losing seasons in a row. And when he hired Tim Floyd, things sort of turned around. Tim had a great eye for recruiting, a great eye for talent, and really sort of modernized UTEP's recruiting. And then he became the Bulls coach, which I knew at the time it was a bad idea, but I'm the guy that wound up leaving Division I and coaching in the Irish Super League. So it's probably not my place to say Tim leaving for the Bulls was a bad, to replace Phil Jackson. That was a tough one. But anyway, yeah. So Tim was really the one that brought Don Haskins into the modern era by being a great recruiter. As great a coach as he was, is what I remember more about him are the stories that I collected and think about. I couldn't diagram our out of bounds plays or our zone offense, but even at that age, I remember thinking, what an interesting person he was, and what a great story it was that he was a small town Oklahoma guy who'd taken a largely African American team and turned college basketball on its ear when they upset Kentucky.
You spend all this time with Coach Haskins. You leave to become a writer in 2000. You fast forward 6 years later, and the film Glory Road comes out. Knowing what you know about history, the time you spent with Coach Haskins, the stories you heard from him and others, what did you think of the film, and how did the film sit with you when that came out?
Well, it's a Hollywood version of the film. The film's not true. The biggest thing that the film gets wrong is that Don Haskins was on some sort of quest to change the world or change college basketball. I think with Don Haskins, he realized fairly soon after getting, El Paso was still segregated when he got there. There was Jim Crow laws. And the Jim Crow laws in El Paso ended in 1962, 62 or 63. But before the national civil rights legislation, El Paso had ended their Jim Crow laws through a man named Burt Williams. Burt was a city councilman, took Nolan Richardson for lunch. Nolan Richardson got denied service at a restaurant, and the city councilman went and wrote the anti-Jim Crow laws that wound up passing. Well, when that happened, Don Haskins was now able to recruit as many black kids as he wanted. There was already 2 black kids on the team when Don Haskins got there. So the film gets a lot of it wrong. Nolan Richardson was one of the players on the team the day Don Haskins arrived.
Wait, we're talking about the same Nolan Richardson that becomes the coach of Arkansas?
Yes, and so who I you'll recall I wrote 40 Minutes of Hell, the Nolan Richardson biography, but Nolan was there got denied service at a restaurant, and that was when the anti-Jim Crow laws got written, and so because of that, Don Haskins was now able to recruit a man named Jim Bad News Barnes, and Barnes was became the number 1 draft pick in the NBA draft, and that led to Willie Cager and Big Daddy Latin and Willie Worsley and Bobby Joe Hill and Neville Shedd. It was all because of the ending of Jim Crow. And Haskins was there. I just think for me, Eric, the idea of Haskins as an accidental hero is more interesting to me. The guy that history thrust him into this, and he responded. He could have backed out and said, we're still going to start one player. I know he's not our best player, but we're going to start just to keep the boosters happy or that kind of thing. But Haskins as the accidental hero in a border town, which is the only place that could have happened in the South, is a town that's 70% Mexican. And because the town is 70% Mexican American, there wasn't the kind of pressure like we need some white guys. It's by having, the Mexican American community has always been welcoming to African Americans. And that's what El Paso means, the pass. El Paso del Norte was the name of the town. And the Pass of the North, it was always a place where people were coming and going and newcomers were welcome. And so I felt like the film got so many things wrong in order to make it a Hollywood story that I think it really missed a lot of the power of the story, is that sometimes history thrusts you into a place. Jackie Robinson didn't grow up thinking, I think I'll desegregate Major League Baseball. And sometimes, or John Amici didn't think, I think I'll break the, I'll reveal my homosexuality. I think sometimes history thrusts you into these places and you either respond like Don Haskins did, or like Adolph Rupp did, you turn your back on it and stick with it. That being said, I thought the acting was very good and it was a fun movie. It just wasn't true.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's your analysis and review of Glory Road.
There it is.
Presented by Bebo.
That's a long walk for a short drink of water, but there it is.
Concise, layered, insightful.
Yeah.
This is what we do.
Well,
Bob, pocket pass back to you.
Yeah, thank you for the assist. You have all these great fortunes in your path. And one of them that we cannot leave out of this conversation is that there's a young guard in high school in Chicago by the name of Tim Hardaway that no one's recruiting except for Coach Rus Bradburd, the graduate assistant on the bench at UTEP. How did you first find out about Tim, and what was the bridge to convince him to give UTEP a chance? Because I don't know what the history. I know that there was a pipeline from New York City to UTEP. What's the background there?
No, and I should say, Bob, that the pipeline to New York started from a man named Hilton White, who was a New York playground guy that had served in the Army at Fort Bliss in El Paso. And so then he went back to New York and realized El Paso was a good town to be an African-American teenager. But for me, Tim Floyd went to the Nike All-American camp. Hardaway was not there, but he wound up asking Mac Irvin, who became very involved in the AAU scene. It was sort of a Chicago godfather of basketball. And, Mac was a dear friend. But Mac said, there's a guard here. There's a guard who's not here. You should write down his name is Tim Hardaway, and he's as good as these guys. So Tim Floyd wrote down Tim Hardaway. Tim Floyd had the worst handwriting in America. It was a little scrap of paper, and he came back and gave it to me, and I couldn't quite make it up, but made some calls to my friends in Chicago, and they said, oh yeah, he's really good. You should come see him. And so I went and saw him at South Shore Park. It was outdoors 3-on-3 in Chicago. So no one had ever seen it.
I love it.
outdoor playground game, and he was very sort of casual. He didn't play very hard, but boy, it was obvious he had eyes in the back of his head, and he could really see the floor. And it was windy that day, but he made every shot. And I thought, wow, and he can really shoot the ball, which of course he didn't become a good shooter really until the pros. But then I just thought, I didn't believe my eye. I went to his home that night, and I just, called Tim Floyd and Haskins and told them how good the kid was, and they wanted me to see him again. So I went back the next day to the South Shore YMCA, and Ben Wilson was there.
Oh,
and
wow.
It was the only time I ever met Ben Wilson, but I just thought one of the things
let me allow people to know that he was the number one recruit out of high school, I believe 6'8", and unfortunately was shot and murdered and never got to realize his potential. It's a tragedy in basketball's history, and he's still, aside from that, a legend because of his prowess on the court in Chicago high school history. So I'm sorry, back to you.
There's a great ESPN 30 for 30. And in fact,
yes,
the fellow who shot him, Billy Moore, is out of prison and doing great work and trying to end gun violence in Chicago. So I went to I was at the South Shore YMCA, and this is something I learned from Tim Floyd, is the players know who the best players are.
Yeah.
And whereas the coaches don't always know, but the players know who the best. So I asked Ben, I said, Ben, who do you think is better, Tim Hardaway, or there's another guard named Anthony Manuel, that we had our choice between Anthony Manuel, and it looked like we were going to have our choice because no one was recruiting either of them. And Ben said, well, I'll put it this way. Whoever signs Tim Hardaway is going to be very, very lucky. And at that time, Bob, I was still young. Even though I was a terrible player, I was still in pretty good shape. So I actually played that day. It was Walt Frazier Jr. was in the game. And I remember Walt Frazier Jr. spun. He didn't mean to do it, but he elbowed me and cut open a gash on my head. So there I am trying to recruit Tim Hardaway, impress him. There's a gash in my head. I'm bleeding. I was a terrible player anyway. Tim Floyd told me after he saw me do the dribbling drills, he told me, you should never let anyone see you play publicly, because if you see me do those dribbling drills, I've had kids ask me at camp, like, are you better than Isaiah Thomas? And I would say, well, it's like apples and oranges in a way. But Tim convinced me to never let anyone see me play publicly after that. That's why I'm not on the playground. I grew up playing playground basketball. But anyway, so at that time, no one else was recruiting Tim Hardaway, and we brought him down for a visit. And his coach, I didn't realize this at the time, but his coach was a man named Bob Walters that was the leading touchdown gainer in Arkansas history and got no Division I offers because at that time, Arkansas was not recruiting African-American players. And so Bob Walters had seen the game in 1966 when Don Haskins beat Kentucky, saw the impact of that game, and it really, really moved him. And so most coaches, we wanted to sign Tim Hardaway early. No one was recruiting him. And any coach with any common sense would say, it makes no sense to sign early, Tim. There's only one school recruiting you. But Bob Walters was so moved by the fact that Don Haskins, who changed the color line, wanted, that maybe if Don Haskins had been around at University of Arkansas when he was a great football player, Bob wound up being a Division III football player because no one would recruit him. And I think that he was so moved by the fact that Don Haskins had come to recruit his player that he encouraged Tim Hardaway to sign early. And so it was a confluence of events. But the fact that Haskins had now I never knew that story until I wrote the Nolan Richardson book and about Arkansas, and realized that Bob Walters was a guy that was ignored by the University of Arkansas and surely would have been good enough for you. He scored 98 touchdowns in 2 years, if you can imagine. But that was at a time when that even high school sports were segregated. That he was playing on gravel fields against kids that didn't have helmets and that kind of thing. But was a guy that should have played for University of Arkansas. So I didn't know a lot of this story until I wrote the Nolan Richardson book.
Amazing. I do want to say to our audience who are younger, and we have many of them, Tim Hardaway goes on to play in the NBA, revolutionized the game with his UTEP two-step, which was a crossover move where he would go between his legs and then in front of his body with a V dribble, and basically architects, a lot of the future crossover kings who follow him, and has a phenomenal career as a multiple all-star selections, all NBA squads, etc. Eric, back to you.
guess what team who desperately needed youth and speed in the backcourt could have drafted him,
You're not going to bring
but
up the
chose not to?
Celtics. Come on, Eric.
Or was it the
Please.
This
Knicks?
is our thing every show. No, the Celtics could have drafted Tim Hardaway and instead chose Michael Smith from BYU, which was one of the worst draft choices in the history of the franchise,
Wow.
because they had drafted Brian Shaw and then lost Brian Shaw to Italy.
Mm,
And Tim Hardaway was sitting right there
mm.
Yeah.
and didn't take him. Bob, there are so many different things that we've discussed already in our limited episodes, and things that we've both collectively worked on that tie back to Chicago basketball.
Absolutely. Yep.
And, Russ, you being from Chicago, can you paint a little bit more of a picture? We mentioned, the late Benji Wilson. You mentioned Hardaway. Russ, what is the Chicago that players like Tim Hardaway are growing up in? And what is it that the game is doing for them to try to get them to their next place and out of Chicago at that time?
Well, I think, in my view, you have to trace it back to WGN and, Channel 9 when I was a kid. And WGN televised every Bulls game. And at that time, in the late 60s and early 70s, the Bulls' backcourt was Jerry Sloan and Norm Van Leer. And so a lot of us, I was a terrible player, but a lot of people from my era, and I'll name them here in a second, grew up watching, with 82 games on a year, and Van Leer and Sloan, they weren't the best. They weren't Jerry West. They weren't Walt Frazier, but they were tough, rugged guys, scrappy, that only wanted to win. And with every game being televised, it was a chance for a generation of point guards, particularly. Chicago is known for their point guards, but there's a generation of Chicago players that grew up watching them. And it's Ricky Green, Kevin Porter, that led the NBA in assists, Maurice Cheeks, that was a NBA champion, became a coach, Randy Brown, Jim Les, Hersey Hawkins, Tim Hardaway. I'm forgetting the more modern era, but
Isaiah Thomas.
Yeah, of course, yeah. Sorry, Isaiah Ronnie Lester, that by all accounts was better than any of them until he blew out his knee. That would have been the best player of all the ones we've mentioned. Ronnie Lester was known as the best of them until he blew out his knee. And so there's a long list of Chicago players that grew up watching Norm Van Leer and Jerry Sloan play, and they were very controlled teams. Dick Motta played very slow, and they were very patterned. But here was Van Leer that was 5'11", and Jerry Sloan that was just essentially just a brute of a guy, just a very competitive guy. And those games were broadcast, and I think really influenced the generation of Chicago point guards.
Yeah, I'm going to say that, people would get surprised in the 90s about the evolution of Chicago basketball, sort of leaning towards like fancy dribbling, boogie, because the archetype of, and I think Isaiah was like an anomaly of that, the archetype of Chicago ball players is really like hard nose, no tricks. We're trying to win the game, and I'm going to beat your ass. If that doesn't happen, that was kind of like the stereotypical Chicago ball player.
Yeah. Well, one of the things with Hardaway, he was known for the killer crossover or the UTEP two-step. But the truth is, and because I was the dribbling coach, people said, well, Russ taught him I had nothing to do with it. Nothing to do with the killer crossover. I learned a ton from watching Tim Hardaway practice his dribbling that I incorporated. But Hardaway could do all of that stuff the day he got to El Paso. He could do all that stuff. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But what he was forced to do with Don Haskins was play a half-court game, slow things down, play great man-to-man defense, feed the post. We had Antonio Davis and Greg Foster, those kinds of things. But I think what Chicago kids can all do that stuff, but they also have the trademark. If you look at Maurice Cheeks, Kevin Porter, Randy Brown, those are tough guys. Those aren't finesse, those aren't finesse players. They're guys that are, they're brutal. And Isaiah was a very tough young man as well. But I do think there is that sort of trademark for physicality, and we're going to win first and that kind of thing. But to get to Eric's original question, basketball has always been sort of a way to stay out of trouble and to avoid the gun violence. But in my until Big Time is coming out in November, the novel. But my previous book, All the Dreams We've Dreamed, I detailed how gun violence has devastated the Marshall High School community, the Hoop Dreams High School, and particularly where it was a coach named Sean Harrington, who I thought when I recruited him many years ago to New Mexico State that he was going to be the next Tim Hardaway. He wound up blowing out a knee, and that it didn't happen. But just
he was teammates with Arthur Agee of Hoop Dreams fame.
Yeah,
right?
he was a sophomore when Agee was a senior for so he's in the movie Hoop Dreams in bits and pieces. But they're Chicago players getting shot. And it's in Rick Tellender's film, That Shot in the Dark, about Orr High School. It's no longer safe for anyone. It used to be the ball players got a pass, like, this kid plays ball, leave him alone. And that all ended with Ben Wilson, of course, where everyone knew who Ben Wilson was, and he bumped into a kid accidentally on the sidewalk, and the kid popped him. And so it's no longer safe to be a ball player. And in a way, it's a good thing. We should all be pushing to end gun violence, particularly in urban areas.
Absolutely. Yeah, you've done a lot of work with Sean over the years to help support him and his journey back. I believe he's coaching again.
Yes, he's coaching part-time at it's the right school for him, Children of Peace. He's a gun violence survivor, Eric, but he's confined to a wheelchair. He only works part-time anymore.
Got you.
Wow. So the game obviously has the power to do many things. It takes us to many places. Give us some insight to your book, Patty on the Hardwood, and how that came about.
Well, in all my books, Eric, it seems that basketball is the backdrop, even if there's not much on the page sports writing action. But I went to Ireland, to work on a book of fiction that I'd been working on in graduate school. And I thought, well, this will be easy. I'm an American, so I know more than the Irish guys do. And I'll just go. And I'm a fiddle player, so I wanted to learn the Irish fiddle while I was over there. And Patty on the Hardwood, 90% of the book is about coaching my team into last place in Ireland in the Irish Super League. It's a very low level of pro basketball, but coaching my team into last place in the Irish Super League while I was trying to learn the Irish fiddle. And so while I was learning the Irish tradition, I was trying to teach the American tradition. And, I think there is an American arrogance, whether it's in the Middle East or Ireland or wherever, where we think, I'm an American, I'll just solve this problem. And I just thought, I'm an American, I'll be the best coach, and we'll just sweep through and win the championship. So most of that book covers our last place finish. Now, I don't want to spoil the ending of the book, but I do think there's an element, they say that history is written by the winners, but literature is written by the losers. And I was a big loser that first year. And I think it's a funny book, but it's also an insightful book. So I do think, it was very influenced by Alexander Wolf. I know you guys are familiar with Alex Wolf's.
Yep.
Yeah. I read Big Game, Small World, and he had a chapter on Ireland.
Incredible. It eclipsed the In Your Face basketball book for me as my favorite book of all time. It eclipsed Heaven as a Playground. Yeah. Big Game, Small World is unbelievable. If you're like a junkie for this sport, it's like an absolute must to have it on your on your
and it's not just that, but you probably know Alex better than I do, but I know him a little bit, and I'm a big fan of his. He wrote the great Sports Illustrated piece about the Barrio Boys, the first Hispanic team to win the baseball championship in Texas high schools. But I find Alex to be big hearted. He's not just a great writer, but he would rather help me than help himself. And I find that very compelling about him, that somebody who's that well known as a writer is still, he'll reach down and help the lowly writers like myself. Anyway, I found that book to be that book was a big influence on me. I'll tell you the recent book, and I think, of course, Where'd You Get Those has stood the test of time. But the recent book, the reason I thought of it is it mentions that book and you is I read the Dave Hollander book called,
How Basketball Can
Save the World.
Yep.
And I thought that was, I thought, well, this will be corny. I think that's actually a really great book. And it brought up things that I knew about basketball, but had never, he, in the same way Dave Zirin does on a political level, I think what Hollander does is he connects dots that I hadn't thought of, of course, everybody knows, of course I knew when I read Zirin, of course I knew about Jackie Robinson, but I didn't get the connection between Jackie Robinson and Don Haskins and Tommy Smith and John Carlos in the '68 Olympics, and I think Hollander does that in a way in that how basketball can save the world in ways I never thought about.
Yeah, I think you're pretty self-effacing, Russ, and
we should be talking about my books, not Dave Hollander.
No, but I do want to share that we're talking about Alex Wolf's Big Heart, and you have one too. You, Steve Yellen, and others co-founded Basketball in El Barrio in El Paso, in the neighborhood, which I believe is either the number one or second poorest in the United States.
Yeah, per capita, it's generally the poorest neighborhood. Although I should say it's not a dangerous neighborhood. You're not going to get shot in Segundo Barrio.
Yeah. But you started this camp and you charged the kids $1 to come down, and everyone gets a free basketball and a T-shirt, and you brought me down as a guest to do my little tricks and run some clinics with the kids. I had a blast. I honestly, I didn't want to leave. I felt like I could have been there for like a month, just because of the warmth of the staff, the kids, the parents. I remember there was like a D1 player. You were like, Bob, play him 1-on-1. And so, well, the kids call it 1v1 now. And so, I did my little crossovers and off the backboard stuff. And he, I couldn't guard him. But everybody was there cheering. It was just like, it was such a rich experience for me. And then I met Willie, member of the UTEP,
Cager,
Willie Cager, before he passed. And, I have such fond memories of that. So what's the inception of the basketball in El Barrio, and it's now lasted 20 or 30 years? It
was our 32nd year this year.
32nd,
but
wow.
Yeah, I when I worked at UTEP, I really, El Paso's a poor town, and Segundo Barrio is the poorest. That's where Nolan Richardson grew up as a Spanish speaker. But I just thought, in the UTEP camp, to be fair, was a fairly cheap camp. It was $200, I think, to go. But none of those kids in Segundo can go. And I actually think that for many years, the NBA was full of guys that couldn't have afforded to go to summer camp as kids. And so what I saw happening is that universities make money on the backs of these kids, but we don't serve the poor communities that these kids come out of. And so what I think happens is thousands and thousands of kids play, and then 10 get a scholarship, and 1 goes to the NBA and 2 go to Europe. But thousands of kids have less to show for it than they should. And so what I wanted to do was to make a camp. Now, I couldn't do it in Chicago because the UTEP, I had the El Paso ties. But what I wanted to do was to give kids an opportunity to go to a basketball camp. But then Steve Yellen and I got Steve's from Fishkill, New York, by the way, and Steve may be the worst player in UTEP history, and here I am, the worst player in North Park history. But we got the idea to start blending in, so we started giving away books, and we have the folklorico dancers and the musicians and the storytellers, and we turn it into more of a cultural and educational experience using basketball as a hook. But originally the idea was I was really embarrassed that kids could not afford to go to camps from neighborhoods. So I think if you went to, I'll bet if you took a survey of Tim Hardaway's high school teammates, none of those kids went to college camps. They couldn't afford to go to a college camp. They would have loved to go into a college camp, but they couldn't afford it. And so part of what I did was a reaction against that. And the camp has evolved. It's different. Each year it's different. We've had Arnie Duncan there. We've had John Carlos from the 1968 Olympics. We've had Beto O'Rourke used to come every year. Wow. And so it's not just, it's actually populated by coaches that aren't really even basketball people for the most part. They're just people that want to help kids.
Mm.
So one more from me, I'd be remiss not to ask, because you've mentioned his name multiple times, and obviously one of your books is about him, and that's Nolan Richardson. So, we're 30 years removed from the 94 Arkansas team, which of course goes by 40 Minutes of Hell, which is the title of your book. And you mentioned Nolan in several contexts on our episode today. So what was it like putting a book together with a man like that, who had experienced so much, both good bad, ugly on and off the floor when it comes
Yeah.
to basketball, life, civil rights, and everything in between.
Yeah, well, we all watched his career closely. I didn't know him well, but played for at Texas Western. He was the first African American player that Don Haskins coached, and he was already on the team, of course, when Coach Haskins got there. But when he got fired, almost every major news outlet in America said he deserved to get fired because he brought up race at a press conference, and he deserved to get fired. And I just thought, well, that's interesting, but let me just see if I can uncover more. Like, he had a bad press conference where he lashed out at people, and he said, I didn't come over on the ship. My great grandmother came over on the ship. And of course, he meant the slave ship, but no one in the press conference understood that at the time. They just thought he'd blown a gasket, he'd gone crazy. And so I think as writers, I think Bobbito's the same way. I want to get under the story and get sort of work against the grain and work against the story that's being told and see if there's more to the story than the headlines that Nolan Richardson deserved to get fired. And I came to understand that I thought Nolan was right about everything that just about everything that he said. And you won't remember this, but when he got into the hall, Nolan doesn't like everything in the book, but that was part of it as well. Is that as an assistant coach, I thought, I don't want to worry about what the head coach thinks. I'm going to write this book and not show it to him until it's too late. Because he said to me,
Russ, I'm sorry, you approached Nolan about writing the book, or you just went ahead and wrote it unauthorized?
Yeah, he came to Basketball in the Barrio one day after he'd been fired and asked to speak to the kids. And I know how these head Division I coaches are. He was going to want a lot of money to talk to the kids. I said, Coach, we're all volunteers. I've never made a nickel. He said, I don't want any money. And he came, and boy, he can really, if you've ever heard Nolan, he's the without question, the greatest public speaker that's ever lived. And so he gave this talk, and I thought, I got to thinking about him that afternoon and thought, he's not John Calhoun, he's not Lute Olson, he's Jackie Robinson and Muhammad Ali. I just was starting to think about him as a historical figure, not as a basketball person. And so I went to him and said, look, if you want this book to be like a Rick Pitino book, no, I have nothing against Rick Pitino, but a Rick Pitino or Lute Olson or a basketball book. But I told him that you're closer to Jackie Robinson and Muhammad Ali and Billie Jean King. You're a historical figure. So in 40 Minutes of Hell, there's maybe 6 pages of basketball, and the rest are the challenges that he had to overcome. And so that was how I approached Nolan on that. And I think, frankly, that there weren't many people talking to him. There weren't famous writers asking him to do the story like there should have been. And he said to me at one point, he said, now, Russ, you've been working on this book for 6 weeks. Where is it? And well, it took 3 years. It took 3 years. He was a demanding head coach. He wanted results. And I think
he wanted you to write it in 40 minutes.
Exactly. But he was such an interesting person. He grew up speaking Spanish in the barrio. And, and he broke the color line at Bowie High School, not by being the first white, but by being the first non-Hispanic person, or one of the first non-Hispanic people at Bowie High School. And so he had a choice, but he decided rather than go to Frederick Douglass High School, he was going to go to Bowie High School, where all his buddies in the barrio went to Bowie High School. And so he's always sort of seen himself, at a time when Kamala Harris is identifying as part Indian and part Black, but she feels fully. Well, Nolan, I think, has always thought of himself as Mexican and African American. In El Paso, he's just seen as one of the guys. I don't think they see him as, he's just seen as he's a son of El Paso in a way that I found very refreshing and very interesting.
That's beautiful. Well, party people in the place to be. Coach Rus Bradburd is a storyteller, a former D3 end of the bench star and pickup player, community activist, and author of this Big Time. And you have a quote here from Jesse Washington, who was our first guest on B-Ball Radio. He says, Rus Bradburd is right on time with his takedown of college sports, money mania at American universities. Big Time is provocative, thought-provoking, and hilarious, as you are in real life. Russ, on behalf of me and my co-host, E-New, Coach E-New, a.k.a. Eric Newman, we thank you and applause, bro.
Thanks, you guys. It's good to see you again, and I'll stay in touch.
All right. B-Ball Radio.